The pattern began in late 1803 in Hammersmith, a parish on the western outskirts of London along the Thames. Back then, it was a semi-rural area of market gardens, scattered houses, and poorly lit lanes, the kind of place where darkness meant absolute darkness, where a walk home after nightfall required genuine courage. The first sightings followed a predictable pattern. A figure dressed entirely in white would appear suddenly on isolated paths, particularly near the churchyard of St. Paul's, Hammersmith. Witnesses described it as uncommonly tall, draped in flowing white garments or a sheet, moving with an unnatural gliding motion. Some claimed to see no face beneath the hood, only shadow. Others spoke of glowing eyes or a skeletal visage. A pregnant woman named Mrs. Millwood encountered the figure on Black Lion Lane one evening in November 1803. According to her account, she was returning home when a tall form in white emerged from the shadows near the churchyard wall. The apparition, she claimed, opened its arms wide as if to embrace or capture her. Mrs. Millwood collapsed on the spot. Neighbors found her unconscious and brought her home, where she miscarried within days. Though her death was attributed to natural causes, her family and the community blamed the ghost. The sightings accelerated through December. A wagon driver reported his horses rearing in terror as a white figure stood motionless in the middle of Hammersmith Road, refusing to move even as he shouted warnings. When he drove the wagon forward, the figure vanished. A night watchman named William Girdler encountered what he believed was the spirit near the Black Lion public house. He later testified that the figure approached him with arms outstretched, its white garments billowing despite the absence of wind. Girdler fled, later admitting he'd never been more frightened in his life. By late December 1804, the Hammersmith Ghost had become something more than local folklore. It was a genuine crisis. Working men refused to walk home after dark. Women wouldn't leave their houses once the sun set. The local night watch increased patrols, but even armed groups admitted to feeling unnerved when passing the churchyard or certain stretches of lane where sightings had occurred. It was into this atmosphere of mounting hysteria that Francis Smith entered the story. Smith was an excise officer, a customs official responsible for collecting duties on goods. At 29 years old, he was a working professional with a reputation for reliability and courage. He lived with his wife and worked regular hours that sometimes required him to be out after dark. Unlike some of his neighbors, Smith didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in rational explanations, in evidence and things that could be touched and measured. But Smith also believed in protecting his community. And by early January 1804, the situation in Hammersmith had deteriorated to the point where something had to be done. Multiple witnesses had reported fresh encounters. The stories had grown more elaborate. The ghost now pursued victims, grabbed at them, seemed to target specific individuals. Whether Smith believed the ghost was real or a hoaxer exploiting fear didn't particularly matter. Someone was terrorizing his neighbors, and in an era before organized police forces, citizens were expected to handle such matters themselves. On the evening of January 3rd, 1804, Smith made a decision. He loaded his pistol, dressed warmly against the winter cold, and set out to patrol the areas where the ghost had been most frequently sighted. His plan was straightforward. If the figure appeared, he would confront it. If it was supernatural, a bullet wouldn't harm it. If it was human, well, Smith was prepared to defend himself and others against what he considered an assault on public safety. Smith positioned himself near Black Lion Lane, one of the ghost's favoured hunting grounds. The night was cold and clear, the kind of winter evening where frost forms on cobblestones and breath hangs visible in the air. The few oil lamps that lit Hammersmith streets cast pools of weak yellow light, leaving long stretches of absolute darkness between them. For hours, nothing happened. Smith paced, his fingers numb despite his gloves. His pistol a cold weight in his pocket. He spoke briefly with other men who'd also come out to patrol. The ghost hunt had become something of a community effort. Around 11 o'clock, most of them headed home. The cold was bitter and it seemed the ghost wouldn't appear that night. Then around 11:30, Smith saw it. A figure in white emerged from the darkness near the churchyard, moving along the lane in his direction. Even from a distance, Smith could see it matched the descriptions. Tall, draped in flowing white garments, moving with that peculiar gliding gait witnesses had described. The figure was perhaps 50 yards away, heading directly toward him. Smith's heart rate increased despite his skepticism. There was something undeniably eerie about the apparition, the way it seemed to materialize from shadow, the absolute whiteness of its garments against the dark. "Who are you?" Smith called out. "Stop where you are." The figure continued advancing. It didn't respond, didn't pause. Just that steady, unnatural approach. Smith raised his pistol. "I'm armed. Stop or I'll fire." Still the figure came on. No hesitation, no acknowledgement of the warning. Smith could see it more clearly now. Definitely human-shaped, but that white covering obscured all the features. Was it looking at him? Could it even see through that material? Later, at his trial, Smith would describe these moments in detail. The absolute conviction that he was facing the thing that had terrorized his community. The growing fear as the figure ignored his repeated warnings. The split-second decision as the apparition closed to within 30 feet, then 20. Smith fired. The pistol's report shattered the night's silence. The figure crumpled to the ground immediately, falling with the graceless collapse of flesh and bone, not the dissipation of mist. Smith rushed forward, a cold dread already settling in his stomach. What he found on the ground wasn't a ghost. It was a man named Thomas Millwood, a bricklayer, 23 years old, still alive but bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to his jaw. He was wearing his work clothes, white canvas trousers and a white flannel jacket, the standard attire for plasterers and bricklayers who wore white to keep plaster and brick dust from showing. Millwood couldn't speak. The bullet had shattered his jaw, but his eyes were conscious, confused, terrified. Smith immediately called for help, but there was nothing to be done. Millwood died within minutes. His white work clothes now soaked with blood that looked black in the lamplight. Francis Smith was arrested immediately. He didn't resist. By all accounts, he was in shock, repeating that he thought it was the ghost, that he'd given warnings, that he'd been protecting the community. Neighbors who'd seen him patrolling earlier that evening confirmed his story. He'd been open about his intentions, had told multiple people he was hunting the Hammersmith Ghost, but none of that changed the essential fact. Thomas Millwood was dead, shot by Francis Smith, and Millwood had never been a ghost at all. He'd simply been walking home from work, wearing clothes that happened to be white, passing through an area where a supposed ghost had been reported. The case came to trial at the Old Bailey on January the 13th, 1804, just 10 days after the shooting. The speed reflected both the seriousness of the charge and the intense public interest. Smith was charged with murder. At trial, a more complete picture emerged, multiple witnesses testified about the ghost sightings. William Girdler, the night watchman, described his terrifying encounter in detail. Others confirmed the widespread panic, the way entire families had altered their lives out of fear. The defense argued that Smith had acted in what he believed was defense of himself and his community against a genuine threat. But the prosecution presented a devastating counter-narrative. Thomas Millwood, they established, had been completely innocent. He'd worked late that evening and was simply walking home. He'd done nothing threatening. His sister Anne testified that Thomas had heard about the ghost panic, but thought it was nonsense. He'd never imagined his work clothes would make him a target. More damaging still, witnesses came forward who'd encountered Millwood earlier that same evening. A man named John Locke testified that he'd seen Millwood walking and had briefly mistaken him for the ghost due to his white clothing. But upon calling out, Millwood had responded normally, explaining he was simply heading home from work. Locke had wished him good night and continued on. In other words, a simple challenge had been enough to establish Millwood's humanity. The prosecution argued that Smith had acted with reckless disregard for human life. He'd armed himself, positioned himself in a public area, and shot a man who'd done nothing but walk down a street. The fact that Smith had believed he was shooting a ghost didn't excuse the killing. It only demonstrated poor judgment. The judge's instructions to the jury reflected the legal complexities. Under English law, self-defense required a genuine and immediate threat to one's life. But could a ghost pose such a threat? And even if one believed in ghosts, did Smith have reasonable cause to believe he was in mortal danger from an apparition? The jury deliberated for an hour. They returned a verdict that would echo through English legal history: guilty of murder, with a recommendation for mercy. Francis Smith was sentenced to death by hanging, the mandatory punishment for murder. But the case had created enormous public controversy. Many saw Smith as a victim himself, a man who tried to protect his community and been destroyed for it. Pamphlets and broadsheets debated the case endlessly. Some argued that the real killer was fear itself, that the ghost panic had created the conditions for tragedy. Others pointed to a darker possibility, that there had been a hoaxer, someone deliberately impersonating a ghost to terrorize the neighborhood. If such a person existed, they bore responsibility for creating the situation that led to Millwood's death. Several residents claimed to have seen the ghost on other occasions when Millwood was known to be elsewhere, suggesting multiple people in white clothing or perhaps a genuine hoaxer among them. The recommendation for mercy carried weight. Within weeks, Smith's sentence was commuted to 1 year of hard labor. It was an acknowledgement that while he'd committed a wrongful killing, the circumstances were extraordinary. The community had been in genuine panic. Smith had given warnings, and his intent had been protection rather than murder. Smith served his sentence and was released in early 1805. He left Hammersmith immediately, relocating to another part of London where his notoriety hadn't penetrated. Historical records suggest he lived another 30 years, working in various trades, but never speaking publicly about the incident that had defined his life. Thomas Millwood was buried in St. Paul's Hammersmith churchyard, ironically the very location where many ghost sightings had originated. His gravestone, which stood until the mid-20th century, bore a simple inscription noting his age and occupation with no mention of the circumstances of his death. The Hammersmith Ghost sighting stopped immediately after the shooting. Not a single report emerged in the weeks and months following Millwood's death. This sudden cessation has fueled debate ever since. Skeptics argue it proves the ghost was simply Millwood all along. The terrified witnesses had misinterpreted an innocent man's appearance and movements. Once he was gone, the sightings naturally ended, but believers in the paranormal point out the logical problems with this explanation. Multiple witnesses had reported encounters with the ghost on specific dates and times when Millwood was documented to be elsewhere, working at construction sites miles away or at home with his family. Anne Millwood testified that her brother had walked that route home regularly for months, always in his white work clothes, without incident. Why had people only begun seeing a ghost in late 1803? Some researchers have suggested a more complex scenario, that a genuine hoaxer was operating in Hammersmith. Perhaps someone with a grudge against the community, or simply a disturbed individual who enjoyed creating fear. This hoaxer might have been emboldened by the panic they had created, conducting multiple appearances in various locations. Millwood's unfortunate habit of walking home in white clothing after dark made him the perfect scapegoat once the situation turned violent. The real hoaxer, if they existed, would have immediately ceased their activities once they realized their game had ended in death and legal consequences. Others have proposed more prosaic explanations. The winter of 1803-1804 was particularly harsh, with heavy fogs rolling in from the Thames. Several witnesses mentioned mist or fog during their encounters. Could atmospheric conditions have created optical illusions, with innocent pedestrians briefly appearing ghost-like before resolving into normal human figures? Could the power of suggestion, once the first rumors spread, have caused people to interpret ordinary sights as supernatural? Medical experts of the later Victorian era reviewed the case and suggested mass hysteria as a contributing factor. The initial trigger, possibly Mrs. Millwood's tragic miscarriage after her fright, created a narrative template. Each subsequent sighting reinforced the previous ones, building a collective belief system that became self-perpetuating. People expected to see a ghost, so ambiguous stimuli were interpreted as ghostly. Fear triggered physiological responses, rapid heartbeat, tunnel vision, impaired judgment that made the experiences feel more real and threatening. Yet for all these rational explanations, certain details remain difficult to account for. William Girdler, the night watchman, was a professional accustomed to walking dark streets alone. His description of his encounter emphasized specific details: the figure's unusual height, the way its garments moved against physics, the absence of visible features. Girdler had encountered countless people at night in his years of work. Why had this experience been different? Multiple witnesses independently described the same peculiar gliding movement. While this could be explained by long garments obscuring footsteps, it remains notable that separate individuals, questioned separately, use remarkably similar language. The consistency of reports across different witnesses and different dates suggests that if it was a hoax, it was a remarkably well executed and consistent one. The case had lasting legal implications that extended far beyond Hammersmith. The trial established important precedents about the reasonable person standard in self-defense cases. Courts began to ask, what would a reasonable person believe in the same circumstances? The answer couldn't be based solely on the defendant's subjective beliefs, but had to account for what a rational person should have believed. The Hammersmith Ghost case also highlighted the dangers of vigilantism. Smith had taken the law into his own hands, arming himself and patrolling the streets without legal authority. While his intentions were protective, the result was tragedy. The case contributed to growing calls for professional police forces, which would eventually lead to the creation of the Metropolitan Police in 1829. What we're left with is a question that cuts to the heart of how fear shapes reality. Was the Hammersmith Ghost ever real? Not in the sense of being a literal spirit. Thomas Millwood was flesh and blood, and his death proved all too material. But was there something else operating in those dark winter streets? Something that sparked the panic in the first place? Those who believe in the paranormal point to the consistency of early reports, the multiple witnesses, and the sudden cessation of sightings as evidence that something genuinely unusual was occurring. Perhaps a real haunting that opportunistically used Millwood's appearance as camouflage, or a hoaxer who escaped justice entirely. Skeptics note that every element of the case can be explained through psychology, sociology, and bad luck. A harsh winter, poor lighting, suggestible witnesses, and one innocent man in the wrong place at the wrong time. What remains undeniable is the human cost. Thomas Millwood lost his life for no reason beyond wearing the wrong clothes and walking the wrong street. Francis Smith lost his freedom and reputation for trying to protect his community. An entire neighborhood lost its sense of safety, first to fear of the unknown, then to the knowledge that the real danger had come from within. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Hammersmith Ghost case isn't whether the ghost was real. It's the realization that fear itself can be deadlier than any specter. The panic that gripped Hammersmith created the conditions for tragedy. Whether the ghost was supernatural, a hoaxer, or simply a collective delusion, the bullet that killed Thomas Millwood was fired by human hands, guided by human fear, in a community that had lost the ability to distinguish shadow from substance. The churchyard of St. Paul's Hammersmith still stands today, though heavily modified from its 1804 appearance. Urban development has long since erased the dark lanes and isolated paths where the ghost was sighted. But on winter evenings, when mist rolls in from the Thames and the light fades early, it's not hard to imagine how those streets must have felt 2 centuries ago. How a figure in white emerging from darkness might have seemed like something other than human. Whether that makes the ghost real or simply makes the fear real is a question each person must answer for themselves. What's certain is that one January night in 1804, the line between the two blurred fatally, and 2 men's lives were destroyed in the space between belief and reality.
We made it out of this one, but the darkness runs deep. If you think you can handle it, check out the other cases on the channel. Don't risk losing the signal. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. The next investigation is starting now.